Our speaker this evening told me earlier that having lived through the era of the Cold War, he was fascinated to discover that the village where he lives, which is near Newton Pagnell, Junction 14 on the M1, was on the Soviet target list, as was another location just a bit further away. So he was, in his own words, going to be treated to two drops of sunshine should the war ever break out. Like me, he was a runner, but like me, he's had to give up running due to, in his case, arthritis. He currently is a lecturer at the University of Reading, dealing with strategic studies and international relations, but which covers the area of his talk this evening. And so it gives me great pleasure to ask Kenton White, Dr. Kenton White, to give us our talk this evening. Kenton, I've shown you how to use your slides. I'm going to leave the stage. If there's any problems, just call me back on stage and I'll appear.
Will do. Thank you. Right. Well, I'd like to start off by thanking you for inviting me to talk about my research, my book, ongoing research as well. And I've been fascinated with this subject since I was a child, but I've only recently had the opportunity to really dig into some of the material that's held in the National Archives, mainly because of restrictions. Some of it's still classified. But I've been able to look at Britain's commitment to NATO, Britain's defence policy from the adoption of flexible response by NATO, which was in 1968, 1969. Essentially, Britain offered NATO almost the entire Navy, Air Force, and some 120,000 ground troops for the defence of Western Europe. What tends to happen whenever anybody talks about Britain and NATO in the Cold War is the focus is on the British Army of the Rhine. Now, undoubtedly, that took a great deal of the resources from British defence, but I think it also misses the fact that the Navy and the Air Force contributed a great deal and in fact covered some regions of Europe that people aren't aware of. So we'll be looking at that as well. Britain also had a role to play as being a platform for the reinforcement of Europe had war broken out, not just of our own forces, but also those from Canada and the United States of America. In fact, the information that I've found so far is that the USA troops were given quite wide-ranging powers, or would have been given quite wide-ranging powers in the event of a war. And again, not something that gets discussed very much in the material looking at the period. What my research comes down to is that in a period of stable but unpleasant relations between East and West, when the UK knew exactly who its foe was, the location and the capabilities of its foe, who its allies mostly were, even with that information, defence policy was still a troublesome child of the British government. And it doesn't matter which colour government was in power at the time. These are some of the main points that we take from NATO's strategy of flexible response. Most importantly was the idea of raising the threshold at which NATO would be forced to use nuclear weapons. Prior to flexible response, the end of the 1960s, the tendency had been, but was diminishing, to look at massive retaliation for any kind of aggression on the part of the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact. But to do that, NATO had to increase its conventional forces to be able to react flexibly, which is exactly what flexible response required. This relied on, to a large degree, conventional deterrence, which only works when you have capable conventional forces. NATO quite openly said that it would take advantage of technological developments to balance its inferiority in numbers, and we'll look at that later as in terms of armour and anti-armour weapons, but also naval and air-delivered ordnance. But also the whole policy from the UK government was that Britain would defend Western Europe and itself as part of NATO, not as an individual country, not separate from NATO, not separate from all of the other nations, but as a part of collaborative defence. Now, here's one of the reasons that my research period begins in the late 70s. This is a document that I found in the National Archives, and I've typed out the words that are written in Jim Callaghan's handwriting on the right-hand side. It says, "I take it someone has worked out whether we can defend ourselves." Well, lots of people had looked at whether we could defend ourselves, and the answer tended towards no. Now, the reason to a large extent that was the answer was the previous defence reviews that had taken place. Fred Mulley, who was Jim Callaghan's defence secretary, referred to the defence cuts made under Dennis Healey, so that's the second half of the 1960s, as crazy. That was his word, which had left the home islands undefended. John Knott, when the Conservatives came into power, said that it could be argued that the reviews of the 60s and 70s went too far. I think that's a classic case of British understatement. However, Knott said in the 1981 Defence Review that hard decisions reflect our resolve to give defence the resources Britain's security demands, in accordance with realistic, unsentimental and up-to-date judgment of what will be most relevant and effective in future years. The problem that comes out of almost every defence review is that it's not reviewing defence, it's not reviewing threats, it's not reviewing capabilities. What it's reviewing is money. How much money can we afford to spend on defence? The Joint Intelligence Committee between 1968 and 1977 assessed the threat from the Warsaw Pact to include, in that period, an additional 100 nuclear-powered submarines, 260 new major warships, the equivalent of 6 infantry divisions and 2,000 tanks, and some 250 new aircraft. Regardless of that threat assessment, almost nothing was done to provide the British Army of the Rhine, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy with assets to counter that expected threat. The fact that the threat didn't necessarily manifest itself in the way that the Joint Intelligence Committee assessed is less relevant to what we're looking at today than the assessment of the threat itself. The British government had to coordinate with NATO to prepare the defence of Western Europe and the home islands. So there was a mutually agreed alert system within NATO, which also translated into the British government's alert system, but they weren't identical. So there were gaps in the NATO warning system which weren't filled in the British government system and vice versa. And the document for that is available in the National Archives, the Government War Book, which covers the gaps that exist between the two. So even the simple process of marrying up alerts from NATO to the British government wasn't implemented. By the late 1970s, the British government had come to terms with the idea that the Warsaw Pact would be able to attack the West with as little as 48 hours warning. Now, 48 hours was not sufficient for anything more than the troops in place in Germany to reach their defensive positions. The problem with that kind of short warning attack would be that there would be no opportunity for any of the reservists for the Air Force, the Army or the Navy to be called up. But again, not part of the threat assessment and expensive. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with NATO's structure, we have Allied Forces North, which is essentially Norway and Denmark. We have Allied Forces Centre, Germany, and Allied Forces South, basically Italy. The British Army was pretty much dedicated to Germany, the northern half of Germany, in what was called the layer cake, surrounded by other NATO nations. Britain also contributed the Royal Marines, which invariably, according to the documentation I found, would have ended up either in Denmark or Norway. But the air region over the United Kingdom was also a responsibility of the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy to protect. The seas around the United Kingdom were the responsibility of the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force to protect as well. But the land element of the United Kingdom was not part of NATO defence policy. That was down to the United Kingdom government. So you have the UK air defence region over the UK, but the ground forces, some 100,000 troops, were under the control of the British government. From the documents I've seen, there is an expectation that many of those troops would be diverted, let's use that word, across to Germany. But essentially, the land forces were in the United Kingdom to defend the nuclear deterrent warheads and air bases. And we'll come to that again in a little while. In between, as we all know, in between the United Kingdom and Europe is the Channel and the North Sea. And this area was to be defended by, to a large extent, the Royal Navy, with air cover from the Royal Air Force. So we have a much broader range of responsibility than just the British Army of the Rhine in Germany. But we also have to remember that Britain had a large number of out-of-area commitments, the remaining dependencies from the tail end of the empire. And I think you can all guess that I'm thinking primarily about the Falkland Islands. Now, when I talk about the government war book and something called the transition to war, and I mentioned the 48-hour warning time, you can see here 2 pages from the government war book. The right-hand page shows the instructions that were to be followed for the call out of reservists. Now, bearing in mind, this could take up to 30 days. So a 48-hour warning meant the reservists were effectively useless. The British Army of the Rhine consisted of 55,000 troops. The reservists would have brought that number up to around 100, 120,000, but only given enough time for the Queen's orders to have been put into place and the troops shipped across the Channel to Germany. On the left-hand side, you can see one of the emergency measures that was to be put in place in time of war. And I've included this because the civilian side of the government war book and what would happen in the event of a war tends to focus on nuclear attack. And I don't know how many people have seen the film Threads, which dramatized a nuclear war. But there were a large number of emergency powers that would be put into place simply for conventional wars, to give the government and its representatives the resources and the wherewithal to perform their function. And here we see the instructions to requisition vehicles and buildings and petrol stations. More importantly, fuel was to be strictly controlled by the government, not just in petrol stations, but in refineries, and even down to fuel that was left in tankers would be under the control of the government very quickly. Food as well. There are instructions for controlling food storage and distribution, and the requisitioning of vehicles and petrol stations is a significant part of that process of control and distribution. Now, I talked about the air cover of the United Kingdom. United Kingdom Air Defence Region, or UKADR, also comprised the United Kingdom Air Defence ground environment. Now, I know I said that the ground wasn't covered under NATO, but the United Kingdom Air Defence ground environment is. Okay, slightly confusing. What that meant was airfields, airports that were protected were covered by the air defence ground environment. So anything directly involved in the UK air defence region, radars, missile launchers, airfields, anything that was used by the military would be defended by the military. Anything outside of that would not be the responsibility of NATO. So there was a potential for misunderstanding. And this is where the fact that the Americans had quite wide-ranging powers comes in. The fact that some of the US Air Force bases, the troops defending them were American, and under wartime rules had the opportunity to use, were allowed to use force and, if necessary, lethal force to protect the airfields. So we have a situation where foreign troops on British soil were legally allowed to shoot British citizens if it was to protect a cruise missile base or something like that. But defense of the radar stations, defense even of the North Sea oil rigs, which again is something that doesn't get discussed, was the responsibility of the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. Now, when we're talking about surface-to-air missiles, this is one of my favourite pieces of information that I found in the archives. This is a Bristol Bloodhound surface-to-air missile, as it says, fast, long-range missile. It was originally designed and built in the 1950s and had been upgraded in the 1960s. But by the 70s, it was effectively technologically obsolete and wasn't very good against fast-moving targets. But the most important fact about Bloodhound, given that this was the surface-to-air missile that was employed in the defence of the V-bomber stations, was that we only had one reload for each launcher. And let me repeat that, one reload. So 2 missiles per launcher, one in the launcher, one in a box ready to go. That was it. I think it's not just me that was surprised to see that, given that the air defence of Britain was crucial for the long-term viability of any defence of Western Europe. When we start to look at the naval defence of Europe, we're looking here at the Eastern Atlantic and what we refer to as the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And that's where the SOSUS line ran so that we could monitor Soviet submarines breaking out into the Atlantic. Britain was expected to provide maritime cover for the whole of Eastland, supported by other nations, and to cover incoming convoys for the reinforcement of Europe from North America. The Navy was also expected to protect the coastline of Britain and to provide naval cover for shipping between Britain and the ports in Belgium and the Netherlands, which were vital for the reinforcement of BAOR and also for US troops crossing to Germany. By 1986, NATO had said to Britain that it expected the Royal Navy to provide 55 escorts, so smaller ships, for Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic, with 35 of them being at a high state of readiness, so not in refit, not in upgrade, not in training. But because of budget cuts by the UK government, Britain only offered 40 to NATO, all of which were at a lower readiness overall than NATO had asked for. In the same period, 13 escort ships were requested for the Channel. But again, because of budget cuts, 10 were offered. Another interesting point is that Britain, being an island, was vulnerable to mining operations by the Soviet Union. But Britain had insufficient minesweepers to keep more than 2 ports open at any one time. One of those ports would by necessity be the harbour where the nuclear submarines were stationed, which meant that one other harbour could be kept open. So it was basically a choice of one of the harbours on the south or the east coast to provide support to Europe. And that doesn't take into account any attrition on the minesweepers that might have taken place, nor does it take into account strikes by the long-range bombers of the Red Air Force on any of the harbours in Britain or Belgium or the Netherlands. Now here I will move on to the British Army of the Rhine. But before I do, this is an image of the layout of British First Corps defence in Germany from about 1983 onwards. Prior to that, to save money, the government had effectively removed the brigade HQ level of the British Army in Germany and basically called the brigades field forces. But that was found to be unsatisfactory. So from about 1976 to 1983, the British Army of the Rhine functioned without a brigade level headquarters, throughout the army. But come 1983, the BAOR returned to 4 divisions, 3 armoured, 1 infantry, 1 mobile infantry. But the infantry division consisted mainly of territorial units that were based in the UK to save money. And these would be mobilised in time of war and shipped across the Channel to Belgium, to the Netherlands. And I think I'm right in saying yes. I'm going to flip between these 2 images, so you'll forgive me. And you can see here the route that was taken or would be taken by the troops to reinforce the divisions in place. So if we go back to what I said about the 48-hour warning time, we would be left without the reserves. So effectively, we lose the bottom box, which is the 2nd Infantry Division, which would have protected the core rear area and communications, because they wouldn't have been mobilised in time. Remember, it would take up to 30 days to mobilise the reserves and the territorials to get them across to protect the core rear area. And this is why the warning times were so important. The British Army of the Rhine, 55,000 troops, were permanently deployed. The Royal Marine Commandos, as I said, were usually, not always, but according to the plans I've seen, usually designated as part of the UK Netherlands Amphibious Force and would inevitably have supported Denmark, with a limited possibility of going into Norway. 60,000 regular and reservist troops had to be brought across, given enough warning time, and moved through the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany to their defensive positions. But all of the trials, all of the exercises were done without taking into account the impact of Russian airstrikes on the ports that were to be used, or even on the communications between the ports and the rear areas. So roads, rail, canals, that kind of thing. And this gave those watching the exercises a false sense of reality. Things moved very smoothly within the realms of smooth for any kind of military exercise. But one of the problems that arose from exercise Lionheart and some of the exercise, I think Crusader was the one that preceded Lionheart, was that military commanders were dubious about having enough troops to fulfill all of the demands that the British government and NATO placed on them. And I have one quote here from a senior officer who said, "There are already more tasks than the army is able to undertake, and the other two services are already fully committed." So we can see that although the policy was fully supportive of membership of NATO for taking part in the defence of Western Europe, the resources given to the armed forces were less than adequate to actually perform the functions that they were given. Now, I hope most of you recognise the venerable old chieftain. The threat that was assessed from the Soviet Union was one of large, heavy armour attacks across the inner German border through Germany to the Rhine within 5 to 7 days, and possibly then on to the Channel ports. So the response to that threat was the use of armour in the counter-armour role, but also anti-tank guided missiles. This was to provide sufficient forces for the British Army of the Rhine in the anti-armour role. And I think we can see here the beginnings of the disparity in strategic terms between ends, ways and means. We know what the enemy capability and threat is. It's armour-heavy divisions crashing across the inner German border and basically crashing through any defences that were there. The answer to that was the profligate use of anti-tank guided missiles and main tank rounds. The Chieftain was the replacement for the Centurion, but it had initial problems with the power plant and gearbox, and despite these, it had continued in use. It had been upgraded and improved. But by the early 80s, the British Army was beginning to worry that it was going to be outclassed by the new generation of Soviet tanks. And a project was undertaken in the late 70s and early 80s to develop a successor. And the successor is here. Due to cost increases and other delays, the plan for developing what was known as MBT-80 was abandoned and Challenger tanks were purchased. Now, Challenger had been developed for the Iranian army, but because of the Iranian Revolution, that sale had fallen through. So the army got tanks ready to go, but these tanks hadn't been designed with Germany in mind. So they got a weapon system that was not designed to their requirements. We also find that NATO wanted BAOR to field more than 600 of the new Challengers by 1989. But because of financial and developmental constraints, the chieftains would not be replaced on a one-to-one basis. The NATO force proposals also wanted 2 additional tank regiments to be raised. But the British government's answer to that was the simple expedient of reducing the number of tanks in existing regiments and reusing the spares in the new units. Now, that didn't necessarily fulfill the requirements that NATO asked of it. So we have a limited number of tanks, significantly limited number of tanks. But I also mentioned the profligate use of anti-tank guided missiles. And this was one of the technological developments that I mentioned earlier that the British government leaned heavily on. And it fulfills the means to the ends. By the 1970s, the British Army anti-tank guided weapons included Milan, Swingfire, TOW, and HOT. They also had small shoulder launch, short range, unguided weapons such as the M72 and Law 80. But by the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 1980s, the British government publicly recognised the need to improve the anti-armour capabilities. And this was mentioned in the 1980 statement on the defence estimates. The NATO force proposals for the period required that by the end of 82, the British Army have 630 Milan systems in place and ready to go, with each infantry battalion employing 24 launchers. The Milan was also developed to be deployed in the FV432 armoured personnel carrier and had dedicated turrets designed for the Spartan armoured vehicle. But having the launchers, as we saw with Bloodhound, is not enough. You have to have the missiles to fire. And again, I use the word, the profligate use of the missiles. There was a suggestion by NATO that more than 20,000 additional Milan missiles should be added to the UK's inventory between 1979 and 1984. But declared planning said there would be 11,000 more by 1982. There was another review that followed that, which recommended an additional 28,000 missiles. So that's more than NATO asked for. And this same study indicated that almost 40,000 of all types of anti-armour missiles would be required for only 6 days of war. And this was at medium usage rates. What we find is that the alteration in the number of launchers deployed meant that the war reserves that the British government had in place dropped from 58% of the required total to only 36% in 1986. So as the number of launchers increased and the number of missiles remained roughly the same, the actual war reserve itself dropped. The government said that the war reserve would reach 100% in 1989. And what also happened in 1989 meant that that war reserve was no longer needed. So it had never achieved its expected level. So I think we can conclude, and I will begin to wrap up here, that the British government did what is referred to in political circles as muddling through. very often commentators will, and academics like me, will say that the British Army showed just how capable it was by its performance in the first Gulf War. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the armed forces performed magnificently in the first Gulf War, but that wasn't as a result of government policy up to 1991. In fact, it was despite the government policy. In the first Gulf War, the entire logistical effort of the British Army of the Rhine was used to keep one enhanced division in the field. The tail for the British Army of the Rhine had been cut continuously through the Cold War, and the mantra was cut the tail to provide for the teeth. But it meant that when it came to actually fighting a war, the war reserves weren't there, the materiel required by the troops wasn't available in the quantities required as quickly as required. The tanks that were shipped, the Challenger 1 that were shipped to the first Gulf War, had a 23% availability while they were being used in Germany, which clearly isn't sufficient for fighting a war. So what happened was that every spare, every piece of equipment was cannibalized in order to keep the armored division in the field. 95% of the Royal Corps of Transport was deployed on the operation in the Gulf. And again, I quote here, all RAF Germany support helicopters were deployed for Op Granby. So that's the whole of the RAF support to provide helicopter support for one enhanced division. So I think you can see where I'm going with this, and that is that the British government policy, although it was clearly stated, was not converted into ways and means to fulfill the commitment that Britain had to the NATO strategy of flexible response. I think we can also see a reflection of this since the end of the Cold War, and even today, where we have more horses than tanks in the army, and the government thinks that 2.5% of GDP on defence is a war footing. And it all comes down to the fact that we apparently won the Cold War. I prefer to think of it that the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union lost the Cold War despite NATO. And on that note, I will hand back control of the system. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kenton. I know that I'm not alone in the audience to have lived through that experience of life in the British Army of the Rhine. And so much of what you said this evening rings so true with me. I also was a young officer undertaking the staff qualification exams for the Army Staff College during this period. So flexible response was, we were all trying to get our heads around what it meant. And later, when I served with in a number of NATO appointments, I had first-hand experience of the fact that the British really played lip service to NATO policy. They relied more on their special relationship with the Americans than they did with their European partners, and I don't think much has changed since. Anyway, there are questions coming in.
Good.
The first one, excuse me, is actually a statement more than a question, but it will be nice to get your comment on it.
Yes.
And it's from George, who said Polaris and the Navy took over the deterrent role in 1967, 1968, after which the V-Force had only a secondary role. So defending their bases with Bloodhound then was far less important than it was in the 1950s and the 1960s. Would you care to comment?
Yes. Yeah, sure. The V-Force was not the frontline nuclear strike force, but the airfields where the interceptors were based were also protected by Bloodhound. So the Lightnings, personally my favorite aircraft of the Cold War period, had Bloodhound defenses. So we're not just talking about protecting the V-Force, we're talking about protecting any airfield that was employed by the military, and protecting them against not just standoff attacks by some of the more capable Soviet aircraft, but also direct attacks, dumb bombs being dropped, that kind of thing. So it was very important to have a long-range missile to hold these aircraft at arm's length, something that could only be done for a day or two at the beginning of a war. And the more I look at the capabilities that the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army had, the more I'm convinced that the British government only expected the war to last 3, perhaps 4 days before the first release of nuclear weapons was approved. And I don't know if anybody has any comment on that, but that's certainly the feeling I get. And having interviewed some troops that were deployed in the Army of the Rhine, they said they had a 6-day shelf life. So I think anywhere between 3 and 6 days before nuclear release was approved. And this goes directly against the first point that flexible response was looking to fix, which was the raising the nuclear threshold. And I don't think it did that. Hopefully that answers.
It does. I'm certain it didn't raise the nuclear threshold.
No.
I agree with your commentators that we were thinking that we were going to be there for 6 or 7 days before the inevitable decision had to be taken.
Yes.
Andrews has stated it's a common assumption that using nuclear weapons in World War III would be a political choice. However, I heard the following from an RAF veteran who served on maritime reconnaissance aircraft in the 1970s. Said that the principal weapons available to use against Soviet submarines were nuclear depth charges. Therefore, World War III would have had to be a nuclear war right from the start. I'd be interested to hear your views on this.
That's a fascinating question. Thanks, Andrew. The whole process surrounding the deployment and use of nuclear weapons, certainly in the British Army, is a bit vague. Most of the documents that are in the archives are still secret, and therefore you can't get access to them. But reading between the lines, things like nuclear depth charges and nuclear torpedoes would have been on board ship. Now, whether that meant that the captains of those vessels had authority to use them is a different matter. I know from some of the documents in the archives that conventional weapons were in very, very short supply. Some of the surface-to-surface missiles that the Royal Navy used were expected to be exhausted within 24 hours of the beginning of a war, which means that I think your statement is probably correct, that within 24 hours at the beginning of any conflict at sea, nuclear weapons would have been used. 95% convinced of that. Now, whether that would have transferred immediately to land use, I think is a different question. There is a slightly different psychology that I've sensed between using nuclear weapons at sea and striking land targets. Now, I know that sounds a little bit odd, but it appears from the available documents that there was almost an expectation that if nuclear weapons were used at sea, that would not initiate immediately even a local tactical exchange on land. So there's a bit of a balance to be had, but I think your statement is probably correct.
Thank you. Rowan has asked this question, which I know many people will be thinking, with the benefit of hindsight, of course. The Warsaw Pact looked very impressive on paper. Was its effectiveness also likely to be less in practice?
On a tank for tank, aircraft for aircraft, ship for ship basis, less effective than almost everything in the NATO arsenal, yes. But we also have to accept that any conflict on the Central Front in Europe would have very quickly become attritional. So if the Soviet Union have 10,000 tanks and NATO has 8,000 tanks, attrition being what it is, if the last tank standing is a T-55, it doesn't matter whether that tank is obsolete or not. It's a tank and you don't have one. And I think that tends to be the fact that gets forgotten. As much as tactics and operational planning in the Central Front were very, very good, there would be an element of numbers being, what is it, the old phrase that quantity has a quality all of its own. So you end up punching a hole through some of the NATO defenses. Inevitably, that's going to happen. And if you can then feed one of the Soviet operational maneuver groups into that gap, you have destroyed the essential part of forward defense on the part of NATO. Once that happens, it's numbers that count. You get numbers behind the enemy, so numbers into the rear area of NATO. And if you think back to what I was saying about the 2nd Infantry Division and them being territorials, they were moved around in lorries. They didn't have armor, not even light armor. So they would be the recipients of attacks by Soviet airborne troops and the operational maneuver groups. And they're the ones least well equipped to deal with it. Once you have a hole through NATO's forward defense, that's effectively game over. Does that, I hope that answers the question.
Of course it does. But of course, but to counter that, of course, your conclusion that we were probably a paper tiger applies equally to the Soviet forces and the Warsaw Pact, does it not? Because as we have later discovered, but of course it's all based on, and the whole theses are based on intelligence assessments, their logistics were probably worse than ours. But
the thing to remember is that they were less reliant on the logistical tail than the Western forces were. They carried a lot more ready-use ammunition, a lot more spares, a lot more equipment with them on a divisional basis. So after the Berlin Wall came down, I think some of the Western intelligence types that got into the East German army intelligence information saw that some of their units were on 48 hours readiness for combat. So they could have turned out of barracks and been ready to fight within 2 days of orders being received. And NATO just couldn't handle that, even given 2 days warning. We're not talking about warning time here. We're talking about the mobilization. So on mobilization, NATO would then have several days in which to get ready for the attack. Well, if the attack's already happening, you're in an unfortunate position.
Ken, I can tell you that we were equally prepared to get out within 12 hours.
I'm sure
Yeah.
you were. I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure you were probably able to get out within minutes rather than hours.
Yeah, we were, but you're absolutely right. It was the ability for reinforcements to arrive which
Yes.
would have killed us. But
Yes.
no, every British Army of the Rhine soldier will tell you that he was ready to go at a minute's notice, and very often was only given an hour's notice before
Yes.
he had to go.
Yes, so many of the soldiers I've interviewed have said exactly the same.
Yeah, so many crash outs with a massive hangover.
Yeah, that's, funnily enough, so many people say that. Yeah.
Helen's raised this point. In the 1960s, the Russians visibly shadowed some of the BOR exercises taking place. Actually, Helen, I can tell you that went right the way through until 1989.
Yes.
But what were they looking for? Tactics used, equipment, tanks, what?
All of those things. So much of what NATO did was done in the public eye. Exercises were covered by journalists. If you have a look on YouTube, there's a whole series of programs on Operation Crusader and Spear Point that you can watch happening. Exercises had to be notified, and very often the Russians would send, Warsaw Pact would send observers, and the Allies did the same with the Soviet exercises as well. But I don't know if you've heard of something called Bricksmiths, which was the military, how can I describe it? Military representatives in East Germany, for example. And they would go around discreetly, sometimes not quite so discreetly, photographing new Russian tanks on flatbed rail cars, or aircraft taking off, or exercises happening. And the Soviets did exactly the same in West Germany. And it was continually the process of trying to understand the capability of the enemy. You're trying to understand what the threat really is. How good is the armor on how good is Chobham armor on an Allied tank? How much better is a 120mm gun that's on an Allied tank? What risks are we taking if we adopt this kind of approach? So they're looking for everything that you've mentioned, Helen, and much more. Are the troops loyal? Are they motivated? Are they well equipped? Are they well fed? All of these things, because to make your plan, you have to have that kind of information. Whether your plan works 5 minutes after you've started the fighting isn't relevant. The basic premise that you've built it on is the information that you can gather before it gets implemented. And that's what both the Soviets and NATO were looking for in each other.
Thank you. George has said, after the 1953 UK Radical Review and the similar US New Look, any land war of any sort in Europe was only ever a tripwire before tactical nuclear use. And we knew then that the Soviets would have used tactical nuclear weapons from the outset. Do you agree? And if so, why was a big BOR of any importance?
Okay, yes, from 53 to the mid 60s, tripwire was the word. But the problem was, after the Berlin Wall went up, the Americans certainly, and the British to some extent, were a bit worried in that, how do you respond? How would NATO respond to a small incursion, something like an attempt to take over Berlin? Would you use nuclear weapons? If you did use nuclear weapons, isn't that a bit like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut? So this is where the idea of flexible response came in. The policy itself was eminently sensible, but it was expensive. No nation in NATO actually implemented all of the requirements for flexible response that NATO had suggested. The weapon usage that was required to stop, or would have been required to stop, a conventional Soviet attack was way beyond anything that any of certainly the Western European governments were prepared to spend. And this is where we come down to missiles all being used within the first day or two, and then you are left with a choice. You either roll over and surrender, or you strike the enemy, large concentrations of enemy troops with tactical nuclear weapons. Once that happens, then you're on an escalation path. Now, you say that we knew that the Soviets would use tactical nuclear weapons. None of the documentary evidence supports that we were convinced that the Soviets would use tactical nuclear weapons. Much of the planning that we've found subsequent to the fall of the Berlin Wall suggests that they indeed did plan to use tactical nuclear weapons, almost like conventional bombs, that they would be used to cordon off areas, to stop reinforcements being brought in, that kind of thing. But it wasn't a generally agreed stance between the NATO allies. They tended to think that the Soviets would behave in the same way that they would. And that, for a long time, was a big weakness that NATO had. In terms of a big BAOR, if you want to do flexible response, if you want to fight a conventional war, you have to have a big army, or you had to have a big army. No two ways about it. But big armies make big targets for tactical nuclear weapons. So it's a compromise.
Thank you. That's actually, I think, the last question we're going to take this evening. But this is from Neil. She says, it's a fascinating talk. Thank you. And at the beginning, I think you mentioned a book on the way. Is there a timeline for your book?
Well, the book about which this, can you read that?
No, it's out. It's blurred. Oh, there, hold it there. Yeah, Never Ready: Britain's Armed Forces and NATO's Flexible Response Strategy, 67 to 1989. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was published a couple of years ago, and I'm just starting a book about Operation Granby. So I'm beginning to do research into Op Granby and interviewing some people who were there. So if you know anybody who was on Op Granby, please let me know.
We know lots of people on Op Granby.
Excellent. The more the merrier. But yes, Never Ready was published in 21, I think. And Op Granby should be coming out in probably a couple of years' time. I'm just finishing a third book about the Peninsular War, but that's not relevant to this evening.
Great. Louis has said, Kenton, please email me. I have some Q documents that you may be interested in. So tomorrow, when I send you some details, I'll give you Louis' email address.
Yes, please.
And pick up on that. So once again, if you turn on the chat box, you can see that people are once again thanking you very much for the talk this evening.
Yes, thanks, Magnus. I agree with you completely.
It's for the first time you're talking about something that we've lived through, unlike the Napoleonic era or even the Second World War, which we read about and comment. Many of us here have first-hand experience of what you've been talking about this evening. So we found it, I think, particularly fascinating. It just remains for me to formally thank Kenton for tonight's talk, and to remind people that next month the talk will be on the Battle of Alamhaufa, 1942. Did we outfox the fox, Rommel in North Africa? The talk being delivered by Dr. John Peaty, and we will publicise the details of that very shortly. But thank you to everybody that attended this evening, those that are watching on replay, and especially Kenton, thank you. I'm now going to close the session down.
Thank you very much.